Lewis Hamilton has just revealed in an Instagram post that he's quitting Ferrari. Could this be the end of his career, or is he preparing for a shocking move to another team? Stick around until the end. This video uncovers the surprising future that awaits Lewis Hamilton. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Lewis Hamilton has just ignited a seismic event in the world of motorsport that is reverberating across every corner of the racing community, both online and off-track. In what many are calling the most earth-shattering and emotionally charged announcement of the modern Formula One era, the seven-time world champion, and arguably the sport's most iconic figure, has made it official. He is cutting all ties with Scuderia Ferrari, with immediate and irrevocable effect. And he didn't do it through a carefully worded press release or a formal interview. He didn't sit down with Sky Sports or Motorsport.com. No, Hamilton chose the most direct, unfiltered and personal route possible, his own Instagram account. The post, uploaded without warning and void of branding or imagery, was stark, minimalist, and brutally honest. No logos. No red. Just a black screen with white letters and a single gut-punching sentence at the top. I gave it everything, but I can't continue like this. With those 13 words, Hamilton lit a match that has now set the entire paddock ablaze. What followed was not a rehearsed message or a generic farewell. It was a confession, raw, painful, deeply emotional, and utterly unrestrained. It was Hamilton at his most human. He opened up with a vulnerability we rarely see from any elite athlete, let alone someone who has stood on the highest step of the podium more times than any other driver in history. He described the atmosphere inside Ferrari not as challenging or complex, but as psychologically suffocating. He laid bare the reality of a culture he called toxic, controlling, and designed to erode confidence rather than build greatness. According to Hamilton, the team was no longer a sanctuary for champions, but a battleground of egos, power struggles, and favoritism. What shocked most fans, however, wasn't just the resignation itself. It was the explicit targeting of Ferrari team principal Frédéric Vasseur, a man who has publicly praised Hamilton numerous times since the Briton joined the Italian squad. But Hamilton told a very different story. In his own words, Vasseur subjected him to what he described as demoralizing, relentless, and unnecessary scrutiny, an avalanche of pressure that he claimed had nothing to do with competitive drive and everything to do with breaking his spirit. He compared the dynamic to that of a manipulative relationship, stating that some leaders uplift you, while others thrive on seeing you shrink. He revealed that for months, he had felt excluded from critical engineering conversations, left out of tire compound decisions, and frequently overruled in debriefs without explanation. His input was either minimized or ignored. Race strategy meetings, he wrote, became exercises in lip service. He was invited, but his voice meant little. Despite his unmatched resume, he was increasingly treated like a second-tier asset. But nothing could prepare the audience for what came next. For the first time in public, Hamilton directly referenced the deteriorating, now apparently fractured relationship with his teammate, Charles Leclerc. While rumors had swirled for months about tension, silence in the paddock, subtle shade in interviews, this was confirmation straight from the source. Hamilton didn't accuse Leclerc of anything overt, but his implication was undeniable. There was no camaraderie, no partnership, no mutual respect, only rivalry, resentment, and isolation. He described how his feedback during car development was often mysteriously overridden by engineers aligned with Leclerc's preferences. He said the garage had divided loyalties, and that behind the red uniforms was a clear internal hierarchy, one that placed Leclerc on a pedestal and left Hamilton as a symbolic figure rather than a strategic cornerstone. You start to feel like a guest in your own garage, he wrote, and that's when you know it's over. What stung the most wasn't the professional cold shoulder, it was the personal betrayal. Hamilton had joined Ferrari with a dream of forging a legacy alongside a teammate he once respected. But that dream had become a facade. He wrote that behind the smiles and handshake photos was an invisible wall, one built from mistrust, insecurity, and quiet sabotage. Insiders are now leaking stories that paint a picture far darker than the public ever saw. One mechanic reportedly stated anonymously, "We all saw it. The engineers didn't listen to Lewis anymore. It wasn't technical, it was political." Another team member described the Leclerc camp as protective, insular, and hostile to outside influence, suggesting that Hamilton was never truly welcomed into the inner circle. Sources say the breaking point may have occurred after the Monaco Grand Prix, where Hamilton was denied a possible podium due to a questionable strategy call that handed Leclerc a fairy tale home win. What wasn't seen on the TV broadcast, but is now being whispered in paddock corners, is that Hamilton allegedly stormed out of the post-race debrief, slamming the door and yelling, "Stop pretending this is a team. It's not." Ferrari, as of now, has not issued a formal response. The silence is deafening. Sponsors are scrambling. Team officials are reportedly in emergency meetings to decide how to contain the fallout. The lack of a coordinated communication strategy suggests the move caught Maranello completely off guard. Legal teams are already preparing for possible contractual disputes, while fans are crashing forums, social platforms, and live streams, desperate for updates, analysis, or simply a place to process what just happened. Meanwhile, other teams have already begun circling like vultures. Mercedes team principal Toto Wolf has been spotted in multiple closed-door meetings, fueling rumors of a reunion. Aston Martin is rumored to be preparing a lucrative offer. Even Audi, yet to fully launch its F1 operation, is reportedly willing to accelerate its development if it means locking down Hamilton. But the larger story here is not where Hamilton will drive next, it's why he felt he had to escape in the first place. In an age where mental health, respect and transparency are finally becoming priorities in elite sport, Hamilton's post is more than a resignation, it's a statement. A declaration that even legends are vulnerable. That no trophy is worth your soul. That even the most iconic racing team in the world can become a prison if the culture rots from within. Hamilton concluded his message with words that will now be etched into the history of Formula One forever. "I didn't come to Ferrari to be a statue in a museum. I came to compete. I came to elevate. But when the fire becomes smoke and the cheers turn into silence, you know your time is up." And just like that, the curtain falls. The dream is over. And Formula One will never be the same again. Lewis Hamilton didn't hold back. His remarks weren't just assertive, they were searing, deliberate, and pierced straight through the glossy surface of Formula One's most iconic team. The seven-time world champion, known for his poise, his charisma, and his diplomatic restraint, unleashed a wave of deeply personal criticism aimed squarely at his teammate Charles Leclerc and the internal culture within Scuderia Ferrari. He accused the Monegasque driver not merely of being indifferent or detached, but of showing an alarming lack of emotional awareness, unity, and mutual respect, the very foundations of what a racing partnership demands in a sport as mentally and physically draining as Formula One. "A real teammate stands beside you when the road gets rough," Hamilton stated. "But Charles turned his back every time I needed someone in my corner. The loudest noise in the garage wasn't a mechanical failure or an engine roar, it was his silence when I was down." What started as a behind-the-scenes tension gradually spiraled into something more corrosive, something that affected not only the mood inside the paddock but the very heartbeat of Ferrari's 2025 campaign. According to Lewis, this wasn't a sudden rupture, but a slow and painful unraveling of what was meant to be a championship-caliber alliance. He described an environment that became progressively more hostile, more divided, and more emotionally stifling following the Monaco Grand Prix, an event that, at first glance, appeared like just another strategically complex race on the calendar. But for Hamilton, that afternoon changed everything. A decision made during a pivotal moment in the race, one that handed Leclerc a crucial advantage and left Lewis stuck in traffic with worn tires and fading pace, felt less like a miscalculation and more like a message. It was, in his own words, the moment it became unmistakably clear that Ferrari had already mapped out their future, and I wasn't part of it. Beneath the fireworks of the race weekend, beyond the cameras and cheering fans, something far more intense was unraveling in the shadows. No one watching the post-race press conference could have imagined what was happening backstage. While Hamilton answered the final round of media questions, his responses clipped and carefully measured, his internal storm was nearing its peak. As the room cleared, he rose from his seat, shoulders heavy, his racing overalls half undone, sweat-drenched and stained with a race that meant much more to him than just a points finish. His gloves were still on, as if he hadn't quite detached himself from the battle he just fought on track, and the emotional one he was still fighting off it. As he walked slowly down the corridor behind the press center, eyewitnesses reported a moment so tense, so intimate, that even the seasoned veterans of the sport stood still. Fred Vasseur, the team principal who once courted Hamilton with promises of legacy and reverence, was already waiting at the end of the hallway. His face was unreadable, an unusual mix of caution, regret, and frustration. What occurred next wasn't a public outburst or a screaming match, it was something quieter, colder, more haunting. The two men locked eyes. No one heard the words exchanged, but those present described the moment as frozen in time. Hamilton said something, brief and firm. Vasseur responded without lifting his voice. Hamilton didn't wait for an answer, he simply walked away, leaving the boss of Ferrari standing still, his expression frozen in a grimace of uncertainty. Insiders later revealed that this exchange was merely the surface of something far deeper, an emotional canyon that had been widening ever since Lewis began noticing the subtle shift in team dynamics. From being a celebrated signing, the man expected to bring championship experience, technical insight, and unmatched racecraft to Maranello, Hamilton had slowly found himself marginalized. Meetings that once centered around his feedback began to exclude him. Upgrades arrived tailored to Leclerc's style. Strategic decisions, even tire choices and pit window calls, began to feel like they were being made with someone else's interests in mind. Hamilton, who had built his career around being at the center of every team he'd raced for, was now orbiting around someone else's sun. Privately, engineers who had worked with Lewis since the start of the season noticed a subtle transformation. The man who entered the team filled with hope and reverence for Ferrari's legendary history had become visibly disillusioned. He spent more time isolated in his garage, less time in joint debriefs. One insider said, "It felt like we were watching him fade from the inside out. Not in performance, his pace is still there. But emotionally, it's like he was running out of reasons to believe." The chemistry between him and Leclerc, once cautiously optimistic, had turned icy. They no longer joked on the radio. They no longer stood together on the grid. There was no shared glance, no camaraderie, no spark of unity. They were no longer colleagues striving toward a mutual goal. They were rivals forced to coexist under the same badge. What's perhaps most jarring is the gap between public perception and private reality. For months, fans have been sold a narrative of balance, of mutual respect, of two titans learning to thrive side by side. But behind the scenes, that facade was crumbling. Mechanics began whispering about body language, eye contact, or the lack of it. The post-race rituals changed. Leclerc would return to the garage and celebrate with his side of the team, while Hamilton would quietly disappear, often skipping media duties, choosing silence over pretended joy. According to one veteran pit crew member, there was a point where you just knew they were done with each other. Not because of a crash or a fight, but because they stopped even trying to pretend. Now, as Hamilton steps into the harsh spotlight of public opinion, he's risking everything to make one thing clear: he refuses to be a passenger in someone else's narrative. He's no longer willing to smile through gritted teeth while decisions are made behind closed doors that erode his influence and insult his legacy. His words, sharp, pained, unapologetically human, were not just directed at Leclerc or Vasseur. They were aimed at the system itself, the politics, the favoritism, the marketing machine that picks winners and losers before the lights even go out on Sunday. Reactions across the Formula One world have been explosive. Fans are tearing each other apart on social media, some defending Lewis for finally standing up against internal injustice, while others accuse him of destabilizing a team already under immense pressure. Pundits are split. Former drivers say they've never seen Hamilton this emotionally exposed. One former world champion described it as a man who's been carrying the weight of grace for far too long, finally putting it down. Others warn that speaking this openly could backfire, alienating sponsors, fracturing what's left of team morale, and potentially accelerating his exit from Ferrari before his contract even ends. But if Hamilton is afraid of the fallout, he isn't showing it. This isn't a man unraveling. This is a man reclaiming his voice. A man who has survived the fiercest rivalries, outlasted countless doubters, and conquered eras of the sport dominated by others. He has nothing left to prove to anyone, and everything left to say. Whether this marks the beginning of his final act, or a new chapter altogether, one thing is clear: Hamilton has torn down the veil. The truth he's revealing is not polished, not PR approved, and not easy to digest. But it is his. And in a world built on speed, silence, and scripted interviews, that kind of truth is louder than any engine ever built. The entire atmosphere shifted the moment they stood face to face. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. But the weight in the air was suffocating. Everyone nearby sensed something critical was unfolding, not through raised voices or physical gestures, but through an intensity so thick, it seemed to warp time itself. It started with a direct, pointed exchange that revealed the underlying cracks within a team that had long been painted with the illusion of harmony. Frédéric Vasseur, not known for impulsiveness, looked at Lewis Hamilton with a gaze that was hard to interpret, somewhere between frustration, disbelief, and perhaps even resignation. His words weren't shouted, but they cut deeply, delivered in a tone stripped of warmth or patience. Several individuals positioned close enough to hear would later describe the cadence of his voice as sharp, unyielding, and final. "You're analyzing too much," he allegedly began, his expression unreadable. "From someone with your pedigree, we expect something different, something more." Hamilton stood still, processing the comment, not just hearing it but absorbing every syllable like a verdict being handed down. His body didn't tense, but his eyes spoke volumes. They were bloodshot weary, not merely from lack of rest, but from months of silent frustration, internal battles, and feeling like a guest in a house he was supposed to help rebuild. He drew a breath, slow and deliberate, before responding in a voice just loud enough to carry to those within earshot. "You demand more," he replied, measured and unshaken, "but deliver less. Less appreciation, less backing, less togetherness." There was a brief pause in the room that followed those words, a moment suspended in silence. It wasn't the type of silence that asks for resolution, it was the kind that signals a rupture. A Ferrari crew member standing nearby would later confess that the moment was unforgettable. "That was the split," he said. "No shouting, no storming off. Just truth laid bare. And after that, nothing would ever be the same." The situation didn't de-escalate, it escalated in a way nobody anticipated. Not more than a few minutes later, Charles Leclerc appeared at the far end of the same enclosed hallway. Nobody knew he was coming. His entrance was unscripted, unsignaled. Yet the timing couldn't have been more poignant, almost as if reality had written its own dramatic climax. Conversations halted, side glances became the norm, and suddenly, all attention was focused on the spatial tension growing between the two Ferrari drivers. Hamilton, perhaps attempting to create a bridge, or at least maintain some semblance of decency, extended a hand toward his teammate. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't theatrical. But it carried weight. For those watching, it seemed like an olive branch, or at the very least, a minimal act of professionalism. The kind of gesture that says, "We don't have to be friends, but we should at least show mutual courtesy." What followed, however, was chilling. Leclerc didn't break stride. He didn't even look in Hamilton's direction. He walked right past the seven-time world champion as if he didn't exist, eyes locked forward, posture rigid, expression like stone. The moment was brief, yet devastating. There were no cameras around to immortalize the incident for global audiences, but it didn't need a broadcast. Several team members, engineers, and communication staff witnessed it, and by that evening, the story had already begun circulating throughout the paddock like wildfire. The silence that followed was more thunderous than any confrontation could have been. Lewis turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing in the direction of Vasseur, whose face had become unreadable. Then came the remark. Cold. Clear. Cutting. "There's your superstar. Hope he delivers what I couldn't." It wasn't merely a bitter farewell, it was a revelation. It unveiled everything Hamilton had been feeling for months: the sidelining, the favoritism, the unspoken hierarchy. That single sentence cracked open the foundation of a team that had worked tirelessly to appear unified, only to have its internal fractures exposed by one driver's unfiltered honesty. That wasn't just the day when Ferrari's internal peace evaporated, it was the ignition point of a long-brewing firestorm. From that incident onward, subtle shifts began transforming the team dynamic into something unrecognizable. The body language in the paddock changed. Engineers who used to exchange friendly nods with both drivers now clearly aligned themselves. Strategic meetings once marked by collaborative energy became cold, terse affairs. Data was still shared, but with less transparency, less warmth, less willingness to collaborate. The damage ran deeper than just relationships. It seeped into operations. Communications from the pit wall took on a colder tone. Instructions were met with delayed confirmations. Trust, the invisible thread that binds elite teams together, began to unravel. And every team member could feel it. The smiles became forced. The laughter gone. Conversations were clipped. Every race weekend felt like a high-stakes gamble, not just on the track, but inside the garage. Leclerc, meanwhile, grew quieter in interviews, choosing his words more carefully, as though aware that everything he said, or didn't say, was being scrutinized. Hamilton, on the other hand, appeared calm to the outside world. In front of microphones, he kept his composure, maintained professionalism, and refused to let the public see the growing disillusionment within. But insiders describe a man slowly withdrawing, not out of defeat, but out of survival. Privately, Hamilton began describing the experience as one of the most isolating periods of his entire career. Despite the prestige, despite the history of the red overalls, despite the legend of Maranello, he felt like an outsider in a system built around someone else. Ferrari, in his view, had already chosen its future. And that future didn't include him. The dream that had once excited Hamilton, the challenge of resurrecting a fallen titan of motorsport, had become a psychological burden. The man who joined Ferrari with ambition and hope was now trapped in a narrative not of his making. No longer a partner, but a placeholder. A symbol, perhaps, but not a cornerstone. And as the season dragged on, the tension no longer required incidents to be felt. It had become atmospheric. Every qualifying session, every radio message, every strategy call was viewed through the lens of this deteriorating relationship. Fans could sense it. Journalists speculated about it. And those inside the team lived it, every day. What happened in that corridor wasn't just a cold exchange between two teammates. It was the moment an illusion shattered. The illusion of unity. The illusion of equality. The illusion that experience alone could rewrite a legacy. And though the cameras missed it, history wouldn't. Those who witnessed it won't forget it. And the fallout from that fracture continues to echo, quietly, powerfully, relentlessly, through every corner of the Ferrari paddock. Hamilton didn't simply retreat to the motorhome that evening. He escaped into it like a man fleeing the battlefield after a war he never agreed to fight. His walk back through the paddock was not dramatic, but it was haunting. Eyes low, lips pressed tightly together, hands clenched into fists that trembled just enough to betray the storm inside. No helmet in hand. No radio messages. No nods of acknowledgement to the mechanics standing solemnly by the garage shutters. He didn't even glance toward the engineers hovering nervously near the telemetry screens. The photographers, used to catching his confident strut post-session, caught nothing but the image of a defeated warrior who didn't seem to recognize the arena he once ruled. Each step he took seemed to echo with a history only he could hear. Memories of dominant victories, controversial defeats, championship parades, and bitter losses. But now, there was no pride in his posture, no spark of vengeance in his expression. What the fans and staff witnessed was something far more unsettling, a living legend visibly crushed under the emotional debris of unrelenting pressure, underwhelming machinery, and the cruel erosion of purpose. Even the few die-hard supporters waiting near the fences, some waving flags, others holding up posters with messages of support, stood frozen in awkward silence. They'd never seen him like this. No one had. When he reached the motorhome, he didn't hesitate or wait for someone to open the door. He slipped inside wordlessly and vanished. Not into the main lounge. Not into the media area. Straight into his private compartment, a compact, heavily insulated room with a narrow bed, a minimal desk, and walls meant to block out the chaos of the race weekend. That door clicked shut behind him like a vault, and for nearly 90 minutes, there was no indication that anyone remained behind it. Not a single sound. No movement. No response to the knocks that began after the first 15 minutes. Team members, some new to the squad, others veterans who had been with Lewis through years of drama, glory, and heartbreak, took turns trying to reach him. At first, gently. Then more urgently. But every attempt was met with absolute silence. Some assumed he was decompressing. Others feared something deeper. A few simply didn't know what to make of it. There was no race debrief. No post-session analysis. No media appearance. Nothing but radio silence from the man who once electrified every corner of this paddock. Even Angela Cullen's absence, his longtime physio and closest confidant, who had moved on from the traveling life, was now felt with eerie intensity. The void around Hamilton was palpable. No one knew how to fill it. And then, almost out of nowhere, Toto Wolf arrived. He wasn't scheduled to be there. Most assumed he had already flown back to Austria or was deep in negotiations elsewhere, handling corporate matters far removed from the day-to-day grind of trackside operations. But Toto had remained in Budapest just long enough to attend a handful of sponsor engagements. That was the official reason. Unofficially, he hadn't really left Formula One. Not emotionally. Not spiritually. Not when it came to Lewis. Word had reached him swiftly, through internal team messages, through subtle whispers, maybe even through an old friend still loyal to both. When he heard that Hamilton had locked himself away in a private room and refused to interact with anyone, Toto didn't waste a second. He skipped the rest of his obligations, ignored calls from executives, and got into a car headed straight for the circuit. He didn't bring a team. No assistants. No entourage. No cameras trailing him. Just a quiet man in a black shirt, carrying a storm of emotions far more complex than he'd ever admit. When he entered the Mercedes hospitality unit, the energy shifted. Conversations halted. No one dared to approach him. They simply watched as he moved with deliberate calm toward the locked door. He stood there in front of it, not as a boss, not as a shareholder, but as someone who still remembered exactly who Lewis Hamilton was. Not the brand, not the social icon, not the activist or the ambassador or the record breaker. Just Lewis. The kid from Stevenage. The fighter who once outdrove the greatest and did it with flair, grace, and unshakable resolve. He didn't knock like the others had. Instead, he rested his hand lightly on the door and said just one sentence, "It's me." That was enough. Less than 10 seconds later, the door unlocked. Slowly. Quietly. Whatever took place behind that door in the next 45 minutes will likely never be captured in official records or press releases. But those who were close enough, those with connections to the heartbeat of the team, say it was unlike anything they'd heard of in recent Mercedes history. Lewis didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His face, tired and tear-streaked, told the story. The eyes that once radiated confidence and calculation were now hollowed by exhaustion. And in that raw, unfiltered moment, something gave way. He wept. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Visibly. The kind of crying that happens when the soul has finally reached its limit. Tears not just of frustration, but of deep, existential pain. Of feeling like a stranger in the sport that once felt like home. Of wondering if the sacrifices made, the battles fought, the battles won, even the ones that rewrote history, still meant anything in a world that now seemed to question his relevance. Toto didn't interrupt. He didn't offer cliches. He didn't reach for corporate speak. He just sat there, letting the silence do what no words could. And eventually, when the tears subsided and Lewis looked up, Toto finally spoke. According to those familiar with the situation, his voice was calm, composed, and filled with something rare in the F1 world: unconditional empathy. You don't owe anyone anything, Lewis. Not this team. Not this sport. Not even the fans. You've already done what nobody else ever came close to. If you want to walk away, you've earned it. If you want to come back, even just as a reserve, we'll make sure you're treated with the respect you've always deserved. Hamilton, overwhelmed by the moment, reportedly took a long pause. He looked down, hands trembling slightly, not because he was unsure, but because he was stunned that someone had finally said the words he didn't even know he needed to hear. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there were no expectations attached to his name. No pressures to perform. No marketing angles. No team orders. Just a door, open and waiting, should he choose to step through it. When he finally responded, his voice was barely above a whisper. Those outside the room didn't catch the full sentence, but insiders say it was enough to bring goosebumps to those who heard it. That might be the first offer that didn't come with conditions. It wasn't about contracts. It wasn't about titles. It was about finally being seen, not as a commodity, but as a human being. And when the door eventually reopened, and the two men walked out side by side, one a titan of leadership, the other a wounded icon slowly finding his way back, the paddock could feel something had shifted. There were no announcements. No interviews. No tweets. Just a sense that something important had taken place. Something honest. Something sacred. In a world where performance defines worth and loyalty is often traded for results, what happened between Hamilton and Wolf that day wasn't strategy. It was something far rarer. It was grace. It was closure. It was the beginning of healing. And in that moment, away from the roar of engines and the flash of cameras, Formula One remembered that behind every helmet, behind every trophy, behind every statistic, there's still a heart beating, hoping to be understood. The motorsport community is currently experiencing one of the most staggering, disorienting, and paradigm-shifting developments in recent memory. An unexpected twist that has left fans, analysts, engineers, journalists, and even drivers grasping for answers, their jaws firmly planted on the floor. The departure of Lewis Hamilton, one of the most accomplished, celebrated, decorated, and universally respected drivers in the history of Formula One, from the legendary Scuderia Ferrari, isn't just shocking. It's unfathomable. It's the kind of jarring, dramatic exit that appends everything we thought we knew about the sport, its politics, its culture, and the very nature of greatness. For months, perhaps even longer, the global racing scene had speculated about tensions brewing beneath the surface. Subtle shifts in body language, cryptic social media posts, strange silences during press briefings. And now, seemingly out of nowhere, comes a thunderous and deeply personal statement from Hamilton that has shattered the illusion of harmony within the red walls of Maranello. In his emotional, uncompromising post, released without warning, at a time no one could have anticipated, he revealed not only his decision to sever ties with the prancing horse, but also the emotional and philosophical turmoil that led him there. In his own unmistakable voice, he wrote, "They wanted me to be someone I'm not. They wanted perfection, but not authenticity. They wanted silence, not leadership. That's not how I became champion, and that's not how I want to leave the sport." These words didn't just resonate, they detonated. Within minutes, every corner of the internet, from sports forums to mainstream news outlets, was ablaze with reactions, interpretations, and emotional outpourings. Influencers, fans, ex-teammates, and cultural icons alike have reposted the message, dissecting every word, decoding its subtext, and amplifying its message across every imaginable digital platform. The silence from Ferrari has only intensified the chaos. The Scuderia has released no official explanation, no statement of clarification, no rebuttal or expression of regret. The vacuum of communication has left a dangerous void, one that is quickly being filled by theories, rumors, and whispers of a fractured relationship that had been deteriorating behind closed doors for much longer than the public realized. Allegedly, cracks began to appear early in the season, during long debriefs and high-stakes meetings, where philosophical and interpersonal tensions grew more pronounced. Anonymous team insiders, individuals with close knowledge of the internal dynamics, have described a growing disconnect between Hamilton's vision and Ferrari's rigid, hierarchical structure. They speak of frustration boiling over in engineering meetings, of missed opportunities on strategy calls, of communication breakdowns that eroded trust race after race. According to one source within the paddock, Hamilton felt increasingly isolated, with suggestions that he was being sidelined, undermined, or viewed more as a symbol than a partner in performance. Another insider referred to the team environment as institutionally inflexible, highlighting a culture that demands conformity but punishes individuality. What makes this development so seismic is the emotional narrative behind it. This wasn't supposed to be a typical contract ending. This was supposed to be the fairy tale, Lewis Hamilton donning red, chasing that elusive championship with the most mythologized team in motorsport history, and perhaps walking off into the sunset as both hero and legend. Instead, it has unraveled in painful, almost cinematic fashion, one man's fight to remain true to his values in a structure that, according to him, sought to mute his voice, dilute his message, and sculpt him into something he was never meant to be. Now, with Ferrari offering no answers, the rumors are snowballing. There is growing speculation that Carlos Sainz, previously sidelined and reportedly exploring opportunities outside the paddock, may now be asked to rejoin the team, not just as a placeholder, but as a stabilizing presence amid chaos. At the same time, discussions are intensifying around Ferrari's junior program. Names like Oliver Bearman, Arthur Leclerc, and even Andrea Kimi Antonelli are being floated as emergency fill-ins. The idea of fast-tracking young talent into a high-pressure, high-stakes race seat may seem unthinkable in any other context, but in this whirlwind of a season, nothing is off the table. Simultaneously, behind the gleaming silver doors of Brackley, there's a hum of activity, quiet, deliberate, purposeful. The Mercedes camp has not commented directly on Hamilton's exit, but sources suggest they are mobilizing to offer the British driver a lifeline, not necessarily as a racer, but in a more nuanced capacity. Perhaps as a mentor, a strategic advisor, a guiding presence within the team's long-term vision. Perhaps even as the face of a new hybrid program, or a bridge to Mercedes' future in sustainability, diversity, and innovation. Toto Wolf, always careful with his words, delivered a single sentence that spoke volumes: "Lewis will always be part of our family." The implications of that statement are profound. This isn't just about pit lanes and podiums anymore, it's about belonging. About legacy. About sanctuary. After everything Hamilton has achieved, he doesn't need a car to prove his greatness. What he's now pursuing appears to be something far more human, a sense of alignment, of respect, of being valued for who he is rather than what he brings to the timesheet. The message is clear: his career isn't defined solely by race wins or pole positions, but by the principles he's willing to uphold even when the cost is monumental. And the world is watching. The reaction has transcended sport. Public figures from fashion, music, philanthropy, and activism have all voiced their support. Serena Williams posted a heartfelt tribute. Rap icons and global entrepreneurs echoed his message. Mental health advocates praised his vulnerability. Cultural leaders pointed to this as a powerful example of resisting institutional pressure. Across the board, Hamilton's exit is being framed not as a retreat, but as an act of courage, of self-preservation, of choosing truth over tradition. In fan spaces, emotions are raw. Longtime supporters are torn between sadness and pride. Many are questioning Ferrari's leadership and vision. Others are pointing fingers at specific personnel rumored to have clashed with Hamilton. Former drivers have remained largely silent, though a few, like Nico Rosberg and Alain Prost, have offered cryptic acknowledgments of the storm brewing behind the scenes. F1 journalists, meanwhile, are scrambling to rewrite the narrative of the 2025 season, which now centers not around title fights, but philosophical fractures, personal awakenings, and the ever-evolving identity of the sport itself. As for Lewis Hamilton, his current whereabouts remain unknown. He hasn't attended media obligations. He hasn't posted anything new. He hasn't commented on the reactions. It's as if he stepped off the stage, allowing the world to process, reflect, and speculate. Whether he's in quiet contemplation, personal recovery, or quietly mapping out the next revolutionary chapter of his journey, one thing is certain: his silence speaks as loudly as his statement did. And in that silence, the world waits. Not just to see what Hamilton does next, but to understand what this all means. For Ferrari. For Mercedes. For the future of Formula One. For every driver, engineer, executive, and fan who ever believed that greatness could coexist with individuality. Because now we know, it doesn't always. And sometimes, walking away is the boldest move a champion can make. Countless followers of Formula One, ranging from casual enthusiasts to lifelong supporters, have long debated the real implications of Lewis Hamilton's high-profile transition to Ferrari. At first, it seemed like a poetic chapter waiting to unfold. The most successful driver of his generation joining the sport's most iconic and tradition-rich team. But beneath the glamour, away from the flashing cameras and curated press releases, something far more fragile was quietly unraveling. What initially appeared to be a thrilling new beginning has turned into a complex, emotionally layered exit that no one saw coming. And now, in the wake of his unanticipated and deeply personal resignation, the motorsport universe is left stunned, divided, and full of unanswered questions. From the moment Hamilton first walked into Maranello's headquarters clad in scarlet, expectations were colossal. The imagery alone was powerful, the greatest modern racer joining forces with the most legendary constructor in racing history. But from day one, the synergy between man and machine, soul and system, seemed out of alignment. Hamilton, known for his individuality, his advocacy, and his ability to lead a team emotionally and intellectually, quickly found himself operating within an environment that, while undeniably historic, was rigid, structured, and at times, emotionally barren. Ferrari is a team soaked in legacy, pride, and a very specific way of doing things. It's a family, tight-knit, exclusive, and steeped in its own unwritten codes. For someone like Hamilton, who spent years being the emotional core of Mercedes, helping to build a culture of openness, innovation, and human connection, the difference was stark. The walls of Maranello, symbolic as they are, began to feel less like a home and more like a maze, one filled with invisible expectations, subtle power dynamics, and quiet resistance to change. He was not simply adapting to a new car or new engineers. He was battling a deep cultural dissonance that no amount of testing or simulation could prepare him for. And then there was the silent tug-of-war with Charles Leclerc. While the two maintained professionalism in public, the tension behind the scenes was palpable. Leclerc, young, hungry, and seen by many as Ferrari's prodigal son, had already embedded himself as the emotional favorite of the team. Hamilton, despite his resume and reputation, found himself in unfamiliar territory, no longer the undisputed leader, but rather a newcomer asked to find his place in someone else's house. Internal voices spoke of debriefs where Hamilton's input was diplomatically acknowledged but rarely acted upon, of strategy meetings where his championship-level instincts were lost in translation or drowned out by political noise. The mental toll of constantly needing to validate his value, despite being one of the most decorated drivers in the history of the sport, cannot be overstated. Over time, What began as subtle friction evolved into chronic strain. Not the kind that results from a poor setup or a DNF, but the deeper, more corrosive kind, the one that eats away at one's sense of belonging. It was not about speed anymore, it was about significance. Hamilton began to feel more like a symbol than a stakeholder, more like an asset on a brochure than a voice in the room. The passion that once fueled him was being replaced by a quiet, persistent numbness. And it all came to a boiling point in one post. Just a few sentences, yet more impactful than 1,000 race reports. "I felt useless," he wrote. "Not as a driver, but as a person." With those few devastating words, Lewis shattered the facade. The impact was instantaneous and seismic. His message, raw and vulnerable, echoed across the digital landscape, retweeted, dissected, and mourned like a eulogy for something lost too soon. In that moment, fans weren't just reacting to a decision, they were feeling it. For a man who had built his legacy on resilience, on pushing through pain and adversity with elegance and fire, to admit defeat, not on track, but within himself, was nothing short of revolutionary. He wasn't saying goodbye to racing, he was letting go of a situation that had slowly been eroding his sense of worth. It was less about performance and more about personhood. It wasn't a career move, it was a human one. The fact that Hamilton chose to walk away mid-season, without pomp, without spin, without the prelude of a retirement tour, makes the moment even more defining. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't orchestrated for legacy points. This was Lewis Hamilton, stripped of the armor, choosing silence over spectacle. And in doing so, he delivered one of the most powerful messages Formula One has ever received. That mental well-being, emotional safety, and personal dignity are non-negotiable, even for the most celebrated athletes in the world. Now, the paddock is in chaos. Team principals are scrambling to adjust their plans. Drivers are questioning their own positions. Broadcasters are rewriting narratives. And fans, those who have followed Hamilton from his McLaren days, through his dominant Mercedes era, and now into this unanticipated Ferrari chapter, are left grappling with a season that has been completely flipped on its head. Yet within that chaos lies clarity. Hamilton has done something that transcends racing. He's redefined what strength looks like. It's not always about fighting through adversity. Sometimes it's about recognizing when the environment is no longer serving your soul and choosing to preserve yourself instead of pretending. This decision, however painful, will resonate for years. Young drivers entering the sport will look back at this moment and realize that being a champion isn't only about fastest laps or podiums. It's about self-awareness, about courage and vulnerability, about knowing when to say enough. For Hamilton, walking away wasn't quitting. It was reclaiming. Reclaiming his peace, his agency, his identity. No other figure in the modern history of the sport could have delivered a statement this bold with such integrity. Because Hamilton, from the start of his career, has never simply been about lap times and titles. He's been a movement, a force, a living contradiction to everything Formula One once thought it was. And now, even in his absence, he continues to drive conversations, inspire reflection, and challenge a culture that too often treats its stars like machines instead of people. As Formula One charges forward, as the headlines pivot and the race calendar resumes, one truth will remain crystal clear: Lewis Hamilton didn't just leave Ferrari, he left a message. One that will echo across generations. And that message is this: even in a world obsessed with winning, your humanity is worth more than a trophy.